Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern here with you, back on the program after I missed last week. Got my co-host Spencer Michaelis with me. He did a nice job filling in as the de facto host in the last episode. If people didn't listen to that one yet, we had Ryan Top from Milwaukee's Tailgate come on in my stead, and I listened to most of it. You guys did a pretty good job. I was impressed, so kudos to the both of you.
A compliment from Jack Stern. What a way to start the podcast.
And I don't just hand those out like candy, so you got to take them while you can get them. But we are back at full strength here. We've had a couple of weeks in the last month or so where one of us was unable to appear on the program in our normal capacity, but we got through. We have a good slate of guests who we can line up. I think the Brewers media sphere is a pretty quality bunch, so you got some good go-to options there for when we're not able to do the program like we normally would. But we're back at full strength this week. We're going to recap the latest two series that the Brewers have played. They have one more left now. They're going back home to face the Mets for the final three games of the regular season slate. Then they will have a day off, and they'll start the wild card series on Tuesday. Milwaukee officially locked into that 3 seed now, so they're going to play in the wild card series. We just don't know who yet. Chances are probably the Mets or the Braves, depending on how things shake out. Those two teams play a lot of head-to-head games in the last however many days we have left of the season. They're going to have to play some double headers going into that wild card series because weather has postponed the scheduled games. So it looks like it's probably going to be one of those two teams. We'll do a lot of kind of playoff-related questions, playoff-related discussion, because that's really what's most relevant right now. These remaining games here for the Brewers really don't mean anything outside of just stay healthy and get yourself in a good position here, try to line things up the way that you want. But without further ado, we'll jump into it really quickly here. So the Brewers, a really rough start to their series against the Diamondbacks at home. Arizona took the first 3 games in very convincing fashion, but the Brewers were able to salvage the series with one of their more impressive returns from adversity that we've seen this year. That's kind of been the story of this team the whole year, overcoming a lot of different things, showing up when people are counting them out. And I think this was a very extreme version of that we saw in the series finale. So they were able to salvage the series against the Diamondbacks, avoid a sweep, and then they took 2 out of 3 from the Pirates in Pittsburgh. We'll fly through some of this stuff pretty quickly to get to the main content. Game 1, Diamondbacks 5, Brewers 1. Tobias Myers getting the start. Kind of a iffy outing for him. He only went 4+, struck out 5, but he had 3 walks and 4 hits allowed, navigating some traffic again, which has largely been the theme of most of his starts here, outside of maybe a couple that have been really good starts. So we'll kind of talk about where he potentially fits into a playoff rotation or a wild card series rotation. Andre Monasterio made another fielding error at third base in that last inning for Myers. He went out for the 5th. That kind of jump-started a 3-run inning for Arizona. Not entirely his fault, but still, that ball is, if not a double play ball, at least one out that you're turning. Instead, it ended up scoring the first run. So a little bit of a rough go of it for Andre Monasterio again at third base. Meanwhile, Brandon Pfaadt got the ball for the Diamondbacks, and I do want to note this before we move on, just how good he was in this start. I think that when you see a game like this where the Brewers only recorded 2 hits and 1 run, the only run they scored was Garrett Mitchell's home run off of Pfaadt. Pfaadt struck out a career-high 12 batters in 7 innings. I think when you see that, it's easy to assume, well, the Brewers are just in an offensive funk, and it's easy to assume it even more so when they got shut out in Game 3 as well. But Brandon Pfaadt was really, really good in this start, and I know the numbers for him on the season have not been great. The numbers in the second half had been dreadful. The last time he faced the Brewers, they hit him around pretty well. But if you were watching this game and just paying attention to the way that Brandon Pfaadt was locating pitches, executing pitches, sequencing pitches, if you want to go back and just look at his pitch plot from that game, he made very few, if any, true mistakes right down the middle of the plate with his fastball. Almost every single 4-seam fastball he threw was in the upper third of the strike zone, including some fastballs that he was dotting on the black in the upper third of the strike zone. And almost every single non-fastball he threw was below the middle of the zone in that lower third. So That's like video game type stuff. That's how you draw up your game plan. Hard stuff up, soft stuff down, especially when you have an arsenal like Brandon Pfaadt does with that four-seamer that kind of plays up from that low slot crossfire delivery. He was really, really good in this one, and I'm not even going to comment at all on the Brewers' bats in this one because I don't think there are a whole lot of offenses who would not have struggled if they were facing a guy who was throwing the ball that he was in this game. So, Spencer, I can throw it to you for a quick comment if you want as well, but to me, this was just the Brewers running into a buzzsaw. You ran into a guy who threw the ball really, really well in this one.
My quick comment is that I agree.
Nice and concise. I like it. Game 2, the Brewers falling 7-4 in this one. Colin Ray got the start. I won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but I don't think he was putting guys away very well. He was extending a lot of counts by making some non-competitive misses with 2 strikes or falling behind guys. But the actual quality of the swings he was getting, these were not good swings from the Diamondbacks. And I know the final line won't really indicate that. He didn't go very deep and he gave up a few runs. But you look at that first home run from Ketel Marte. That was a home run that was hit like 90 miles an hour, kind of a wall scraper out to right that barely got out. I don't think Marte would say he put his A swing on that ball, even if it was a mistake pitch. And then you kind of look at the rest of the start. Just a lot of pitches that the Diamondbacks were dinking and dunking, pitches that were off the middle of the plate. One that I keep going back to was an Eugenio Suarez at bat, where it was a sweeper down and away off the plate, and somehow he just kind of stuck his bat out there and poked it. Gino Suarez had a lot of hits in this series that were, I wasn't quite sure how he was getting to these balls and how they were falling. Like, these are balls off the plate that he was not putting good swings on, and he was just kind of muscling them out there repeatedly. He's a guy who's been hot for most of the second half, and he definitely looks like a guy who's just kind of had everything lining up for him. But a little bit of tough luck for Colin Ray. The Brewers would come back to tie it in the 5th off Zach Gallen with 3 home runs. Unfortunately, DL Hall, who was going back out for his second inning of work, got hit around in the 6th inning, 3 earned runs in that inning to end that score where it ended up. And just not a great showing for the pitching staff in this one, especially for DL, who had some solid outings leading into this one, but not so much in game 2. Game 3, the Brewers dropping this one 5-0. Aaron Savali got the start in this one. He gave up 3 homers on 3 hits. Unfortunately, 2 of those were home runs. So 4+ innings for him. The 2 homers. He also walked 3 and hit a guy. So not the most efficient day for him either. The Brewers in this one, for the second game in this series, managing just 2 hits. This time they were both singles, back-to-back singles to lead off the 3rd inning. This is one where I'm very much on the opposite side, where I'm going to say pretty firmly they just played horribly in this one. They hit horribly in this one. Merrill Kelly was on the bump for Arizona. He was fine, but not good enough to the point that you should only be getting 2 hits in a game, both singles. This was just a poor showing by the Brewers. And part of this poor showing as well, just a little thing that bothers me. The Brewers in that 3rd inning recorded those 2 singles to lead it off, and then Eric Haas comes up to the plate and he drops down a bunt. The bunt does not move the runners over because they record the lead out at third base, and things just really fizzle out from there. I'm not saying that game follows a drastically different trajectory if Eric Haas swings the bat there, but Eric Haas should swing the bat. Eric Haas is probably the last guy on this team who should be trying to drop down a bunt. He's dropped down 1 in his big league career, and that was last year. And I also am not even fully sure what they were going for here. It didn't look entirely like a play that was called from the dugout. Joey Ortiz did not have the greatest read on this one. It didn't really look like he was expecting it. And I don't really blame him either, because Eric Haas is the last guy who you would be expecting to square around. Eric Haas does not bunt. He has not bunted. He's not going to be a good bunter. He's also a guy who is hit for quite a bit of power when he's been at the plate this year in his sparse playing time. I don't see any reason why we're still doing this, and now why we're doing it with Eric Haas. So I'm not going to get into a huge rant, but just don't. Eric Haas should not bunt. Eric Haas should never bunt. So let's never see Eric Haas bunt again. Do you have any more thoughts on this, or can I keep going?
No, we've talked a lot of bunting on this podcast, and I'm with you. I definitely do not need to see the Eric Haas's or the Gary Sanchez's ever squaring for any sort of a bunt attempt to anybody like that. There's just no reason.
We'll move on to the positives now from this series. Game 4, the Brewers with their first 8-run comeback, or I should say comeback of 8 runs or more since 2004, the fourth time in franchise history they've done it. This one started out very rough, obviously. The Diamondbacks jumping out to that 8-0 lead off of Frankie Montas. He had a very rough day. 2 2/3 innings for him, 6 hits, those 8 runs, 7 of them earned, a couple of walks, 4 strikeouts, 3 home runs as well. That brings us to our first listener question, kind of related to what was going on with Frankie Montas in this game. So Pat Murphy said in postgame that he was tipping his pitch grips to the runners on second base. So the runners on second base, who are essentially standing directly behind him, can see into his glove and see what pitch he's about to throw, and they can signal to the batter so the batter knows what's coming. It's not the first time it's happened to a Brewers pitcher this year. Freddie Peralta did it in, I believe, his first home start of the year against, I want to say the Mariners.
Seattle. Yep.
Against Seattle. So the question is from Andrew on Twitter. He asked, is Montas tipping pitches an easy fix that shouldn't happen again? Yes, it's a very easy fix. It's quite literally just make sure you're concealing the inside of your glove. So hold it closer to your chest. Just close the glove more when it's sitting at your chest. Like this isn't a hard thing to do. If he knows now that this is something that was happening, it's a very easy adjustment. Just make sure guys can't see inside that glove. So I don't imagine that would become a problem for him again, especially if he's aware of it now. And then the follow-up from Andrew in this question is, do you see him as a number 2 or number 3 starter in the postseason? We'll actually get to that a little bit later on, so stay tuned. We'll kind of break down what we think the playoff roster should look like for that wild card series. So Montas will be part of that discussion. But to get back to the main attraction from this game, the 8-run comeback for the Brewers, it was capped with a 4-run 8th inning, which started with 2 outs and nobody on. Jackson Chourio drawing a walk, a couple singles, just kind of stringing things together from there. Rhys Hoskins with the big hit, a game-tying bloop single. And this is kind of just a good game for Rhys because he's obviously been someone who has not lived up to the expectations this year. But he was right in the middle of this comeback attempt. He had the double the inning before to help the Brewers get back on the board and really draw it closer. And then he had a good at-bat here, fell behind 0-2 against Justin Martinez, who is throwing you 103-mile-an-hour sinkers, 104-mile-an-hour four-seamers, 93-mile-an-hour sliders, and then a 90-mile-an-hour splitter. So for Rhys to fall behind 0-2 and then work a 7-pitch at-bat and to see everything but the kitchen sink from Justin Martinez in this at-bat and finally just stick the bat out and hit that bloop single, it was a nice job by him. So that's what helped the Brewers tie it up. And then Jake Bauers would come up a couple hitters later and hit the go-ahead infield single to give the Brewers a lead. They would not relinquish it. Devin Williams coming in and recording the save. Another little tidbit from this game, Pat Murphy came to Willy Adames in the 5th inning of this one and asked him if he wanted to take the rest of the game off. Obviously, it seemed like this is one that was going in the Diamondbacks' favor. The Brewers at that point, I think you're kind of realizing, we're not going to catch that number 1 or number 2 seed. Would it be more productive to give the guy the rest of the day off? So Pat Murphy offering that opportunity to Willy Adames, and he said, no, we're still in this one. It's only a 5-run deficit. I want to keep playing. So I think that it shows you how much of a competitor he is. And, the whole idea of him wanting to be on the field, it's not something that's selfishly motivated. Like he just wants to be out there contributing in any capacity. He's a competitive guy. So cool to see that on that front, but that wraps up really what we have to talk about from that Arizona series. Moving on to Pittsburgh, we'll kind of brush through this one a little bit more quickly because this is a series that really did not have a whole lot of intensity at any point. Like you're facing a team that's out of it. You at this point have figured out where your seating is going to be. The Brewers figured that out during this series, but it was already pretty apparent going in. So we'll kind of go through this one a little more quickly. Game 1, the Brewers winning this one 7-2. They had a couple of 3-run innings in the 2nd and 7th. Another start for Myers here. 4 innings for him. Only 49 pitches. This one was kind of short by design, which we'll talk about it in a little bit, could kind of go into giving the Brewers more options for how they want to line things up in a wild card series. The command for Tobias was not good early on. A lot of pitches either sailing or missing down the middle of the plate, but he started to lock it in a little bit more over those final 2 innings, and he was in a pretty good spot when he was pulled. So that's really all there is to talk about on that game. Game 2, the Brewers dropping this one 2-1. Their only runs scoring on a Jake Bauers second inning solo homer. Freddie Peralta making his final regular season start, picking up his 200th strikeout of the year. 5 1/3 for him, 2 runs, 2 hits, 2 walks, and 7 Ks. If you get a start like that from Freddie in the playoffs, I think you have to come away very, very satisfied. So that's kind of the, especially at this point too, kind of knowing what we know about Freddie, I think you can kind of have it in the back of your mind, this hope for a big game, but I don't think you can convince yourself that it's super likely. So if you just take one of these starts where he gets the swing and miss through 5+, keeps you in the game, 2 runs or less, like you take that every day of the week now, I think. And for Freddie to finish on that note is a positive, and for everything that we've talked about this year relating to the inconsistency of his performance and the fact that we still haven't seen him tap into the ceiling, given how experienced he is and the age he's at right now, there is still a lot to be said for making all 32 of your starts.
Yep.
And just the consistent availability for a team that had a lot of turnover on the pitching side. I think that's something that, for one thing, it's a little hard to give him credit for in the moment because you don't know yet that he's going to make all 32 starts. Maybe we could have pointed out a little more like, he's on pace to make all 32 and he's made every start so far. But now that he's done it and you look back, I think that there is a little more credit that needs to be given than what he's received and then what we've afforded him as well. There's something to be said for being out there for every single one of your turns through the rotation, especially for a team that just needed a guy who they knew was going to take the ball.
Yeah, it was extremely important for the team for him to be able to be available, like you said, pretty much. I mean, not pretty much every single time he was supposed to take the ball, he was able to take the ball. It didn't always go how we would have loved to see it go, and we certainly had our nitpicks with him throughout the season. But like you said, once you see the end result, it's a 200 strikeout season in a season that he's made every start that he was supposed to make. Like, in the end, it's solid. It's not, again, I think what we think he's capable of or the ceiling of what we could get out of a Freddie Peralta, but it was a fine season from Freddie in his first season as the guy, like the guy in that rotation. And Murph talked about it all year, and we brought it up when we talked about him, but he was probably putting some pressure on himself at times throughout the season, knowing that he was being put in that position where he was expected to go out and dominate at times, like we had seen from Burns and Woodruff in the past, and even from Freddie in like the second half last year. But like, really, once you take a step back and look at it from a little bit further away and see the whole scope of it, it was a fine season from Freddie Peralta, and I'm definitely not going to complain about what we got out of him in the regular season, and hopefully the playoff picture will even paint it in a better light afterwards. Maybe you have a few good starts in the playoffs, and all of a sudden, any nitpicks people had of you in the regular season, everyone will forget about those because the playoffs are what end up on everybody's mind after the season anyway.
Game 3 of this Pirates series, the Brewers taking this one 5-2, securing the series win. Aaron Savali got the start in this one. 6 shutout for him, only 3 hits, a walk, struck out 5 guys. So Aaron Savali, if this is his last start of the regular season, most likely it is, seeing as the Brewers only have 3 games left. Really solid finish for him in the regular season. The Brewers, meanwhile, hit 5 doubles in the first 6 innings of this one. That's really how they put up those 5 runs. And I'll note it just one more time here. For some godforsaken reason, when they're in the middle of hitting 5 doubles in 6 innings, they're still trying to drop down bunts. There was actually only one of these that I really took issue with, and it was Joey Ortiz bunting after Sal Frelick hit a leadoff double in the 5th inning. Because, well, first of all, you already have a multi-run lead at this point. So I don't think you need to be playing small ball. But also, Frelick's in scoring position already. And Joey Ortiz can hit. Joey Ortiz had tripled in his prior at bat. And Joey Ortiz has proven that he's not great at bunting either, and yet they keep calling on him to put down sacrifices. So that's got to stop. But I feel like it's going to happen in a playoff game. We're going to see Joey Ortiz bunt in a spot where he should be swinging. The second bunt was Frelick in the 6th inning after Perkins hit a leadoff double. This looked like Sal trying to bunt for a hit, which I don't mind.
Yeah.
And Sal is actually a guy who, given the fact that he doesn't hit the ball very hard and he's fast, and he actually, I think, is okay at putting bunts down. Out of all the guys who I've seen do it this year, I think he's okay at it. I think he and Terang are usually the two guys who,
Yep.
If they're going to say, like, I'm going to try to bunt for a hit every once in a while, I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, I would almost encourage that as long as you're not doing it too often, because I think they're both capable of it. And I think it's actually, if utilized properly, is a way for them to just marginally improve their overall production. But Sal is kind of in this stretch now where he's actually starting to make a little bit more loud contact. I don't think the averages are looking any different over the last couple weeks, but he's hit more balls at 100 plus miles an hour recently. And again, he had a couple nice knocks in this game himself already at that point. I think he had already had, it was like another 105-mile-an-hour ground ball. It got knocked down for a double play, but it was hit straight back up the middle. Pitcher just happened to glove it. And then he had like a 95-mile-an-hour line drive into the gap earlier in this game. So is that the time to try it? I don't know, but generally I don't mind Sal doing it once in a while. The Joey Ortiz thing needs to stop. Like, he does not need to be dropping down sacrifice bunts, but we've talked about this all year long. Just have it on the record going into the playoffs that I think they're going to keep doing it because they've done it all year, and I don't think they should do it. He's not the guy who should be doing that. And a lot of times he's coming up in spots where he's probably one of your better options to be swinging the bat in that situation. So just don't do it, but I'm not going to get my hopes up. I'm convinced that it's going to happen in one of these wild card games. Final note from this game, Nick Mears making his return from the injured list, immediately giving up a home run in his return outing. He should have had the first guy struck out, but he got squeezed, so that was a leadoff walk that should have been the first out. Turns that home run into a 2-run shot. And I have it in the agenda. Where does he fit on the playoff roster, if at all? But I think I'll table that for like a minute here because we're going to pull up our preferred playoff rosters, and we can kind of talk about Nick Mears as we go through that anyway. But that wild card series coming up for the Brewers. So I figured it'd be nice to just kind of kick off this segment by each submitting what we would like for the playoff roster to look like, the way that we would try to line it up. So we will pull up our playoff rosters here. If you're watching on video, you can see it on the screen right now. If you're listening on audio, you'll just have to figure it out for yourself. This will probably be up on the podcast Twitter page by the time this episode goes up anyway. But kind of going through what each of us have here, largely similar between the both of us. We both have Freddie Peralta starting game 1, Frankie starting game 2. To answer that question from earlier, we still kind of view him as probably the best option to start game 2. Spencer, I can give you a chance to explain on your end as well, but since we both have those first two guys, for me, it's maybe during the middle of the season, I would have maybe said no Freddie for game 1. But I think once you had Colin Ray start to struggle, Tobias Myers was kind of settling into this pattern of being okay, but not great. I think it just really became clear that I think even for the inconsistencies, Freddie probably is still the guy to get game 1. For me, for a lot of the year, it was always he'll get game 1 because he's got a way higher ceiling than anybody else in the rotation. It's basically Freddie and then 4 other dudes who are all just kind of back of the rotation arms who are playing up a little bit in front of the defense. But I think at this point, even if you just take the standard argument of who's throwing the ball the best, it probably does still need to be Freddie in game 1, even by that measure as well.
Yeah, I think all season we assumed he was going to get it. 1, for what you said, the higher ceiling, but also 2, just kind of appearances and sort of a there's not a clear number one. So the guy that was coming into the season as the ace, who hasn't completely imploded or anything, he's just going to get game one. And at this point, I think he's getting game one because he's the best option to get game one. So yeah, I agree with that.
Then we have Frankie for game two. I think it's a somewhat similar argument. I know he had a really rough go of it in his last start, but that didn't really do anything to change the calculus for me, especially with the pitch tipping thing as well. I don't think he would have pitched well in that start if they didn't know what was coming, because they still hit him decently when the bases were empty.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's just he's got the swing and miss stuff. I think if there's anyone who can have a good game too, it's Frankie. I think the trust level for me with him is probably still a tick higher than it is for some of these other guys right now. So I'm giving him game two. I don't know if you have kind of similar feelings on that. You gave him game two as well.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty much for the same reason. I think we've seen swing and miss. We've seen some decent strikeout numbers. And like you said, it really is one blip on the radar with that last start. The rest of these starts have been at worst mediocre. Like he hasn't really had a blow up with the Brewers before that one. So I'm not going to let that one impact where I kind of view him going into the playoffs.
Kind of ironic that we ended up here because we were both pretty low on the Frankie Montas trade when they made it, and now we have both of us have him starting game two of a wild card series. Game three is where we have the first discrepancy between us. I put Tobias Myers for this one. You put Aaron Savali. You did tell me before we went on that this was partially due to misunderstanding the assignment, but
Correct.
I offered you the opportunity to change who you wanted to put in there, and you still made it sound like you had enough faith in Aaron Savali that you were okay with keeping him in that game three slot. I know you talked about at the very least, it does kind of seem like they may have him lined up for that one.
Yes, my original thought on this was more of a projection, even though you very clearly told me it was not that in your text to me. So that was 100% my fault. But I was looking at it as more how I was thinking they were going to line it up with Savali. But I have enough on Savali where I guess I can make the case for him right now. And that's really that I think if you are using the correct pitch mix, which we have talked at length about, and I'm not going to revisit all of that, but I think he's a guy who 2 times through the order, mixing all of his breaking balls, doing all of that stuff, I think he can have a really solid 2 trips through the order. And that's against righties or lefties. I'm not super concerned about that with him. And I will say with Tobias, I'm not super concerned about any righty lefty splits either. I think both of them can get both handed hitters out. But I think Savali could handle it. And like I said, I would not let him see the top of the order a third time. And I wouldn't let Myers do it either. And we've talked about it before. Freddie's probably the only guy that, barring, a big difference in score, I would even consider letting see the lineup a third time. And that's really if he's rolling more than anything else. So I just think with all of the options he has out there in his pitch mix, that he could go out and he could give you 2 times through really solidly, and you hand it to the pen, which I think we both feel pretty good about with what we have, but we'll get to that in a second. But I'll let you make your case for Myers and also maybe your case against Savali as well.
Mm-hmm. It's I'll try to articulate this as best I can, but I Aaron Savali, I've said this pretty consistently since they acquired him. He's a very capable regular season number 4, maybe number 5 innings eater type guy. But I don't know if I trust him for a big game like this. I don't know if I do. And we've talked about, and I've written about it and did the story on some of the incremental improvements he made mechanically, adding that shorter slider to kind of keep guys off of the other 2 breaking balls or keep them from recognizing the other 2 breaking balls as early on as they did. But man, the fact remains, like, his peripherals, the vast majority of them, it's not exactly the same. The couple differences is basically the main thing is he's allowing significantly fewer line drives as a Brewer, which is obviously going to be good news for your bottom line. Getting a little more ground balls too. But so many of the peripherals are like the same as the Rays guy. And the Rays guy was a 5 ERA pitcher. Really, the biggest difference for Aaron Savali in terms of the results he's getting is his batting average on balls in play has dropped like 60 points And some of that is the Brewers' defense effect. Some of it's some good luck, though, too. When you're getting a 60-point swing, like you cannot attribute a 60-point swing to defense alone. I think it's a big part of it, but it's not all that's going on here. And so there's that for me where I'm like, I think he's slightly better than he was with the Rays. I do. I'm not fully bought, and you probably aren't either, but I'm not bought in on 3.5 ERA Aaron Savali. Aaron
Nope.
Savali's not a 3.5 ERA pitcher. But if he was at like a 5 with the Rays, I would maybe have him as like a 5-6 or not a 4-6 with the Brewers if I'm trying to assess true talent or kind of how he would more sustainably perform in this run prevention system. But it's for me as well. Like if you get into, you just look at the anatomy of these two pitchers, Tobias and Savali. If you are in a game 3, it's because that game 3 is now winner take all. It's tied. You need to win this game or your season's over. And for me, first of all, I think Tobias has a higher ceiling than Savali does, just because it's better stuff. Savali's got variety and maybe a little more deception going for him, but Tobias has the better stuff. And if I'm going into this game 3 and I'm looking at these two guys, I think Aaron Savali, what you've seen in his best starts this year, are what he's capable of when the location's really good. His last start against the Pirates, that was not a good luck start. That was like he was legitimately on the corners all day. The sequencing was really good. Eric Haas behind the plate for him again, mind you. Best pitch caller on the roster. But the location was good. The sequencing was good. Everything was dialed in. Tobias, on the other hand, I think has had mostly starts this year where it really hasn't been locked in, but he kind of finds a way to get through it. And then there's a couple really special starts mixed in there. The 2 8-inning starts, the 11 strikeout or 10, 11 strikeout start against the Rockies. But other than that, it's kind of sustainably been, he's not at his best, but he's still getting it done. And I just feel like if you're trying to pick between these two guys, one, I think Tobias has the higher ceiling, but also is just less likely to have a blow up start, in my opinion. If you send both of these guys out there, or not both of them, if you send one of these guys out there, whether it's Tobias or Savali, if Tobias goes out there and is not great, I think you can survive. If Savali goes out there and is not great, I'm not quite as convinced you can survive. Like I think there's a higher chance that Savali could put you in a very early hole.
Yeah.
And again, like it's at this point where like I still think you are splitting hairs between the two guys. But like that's kind of what you need. That's where we're at this point.
Yeah.
Like when you're talking about this stuff and you're making these kind of decisions, you do have to start splitting hairs.
Yes.
Because you got to make a decision and it's got to be the right one. So in the if this is the regular season, I would not care. If like it's an average regular season game, I'm looking at Tobias Myers and Aaron Savali as more or less the same guy. For a playoff series like this, where the implications are so much higher and you're really trying to decide who's going to pitch when, and you really like, you have to dig deep to really find the way to separate that and to differentiate and line it up. Like Tobias is like ahead of Savali by a couple of hairs for me. And that's really what the hair is. It's the caliber of the stuff and almost kind of like how likely are you to still be in the game if they don't come out with their best stuff. And I feel a little better about that with Tobias, but unless you have a clear response to that, I think it leads nicely into one of the questions we got, because it does kind of relate to that. Do you have something you want to say first? Or
no, I mean, I would say I would probably lean Tobias personally, but I thought I could make a case for Savali. That was why I decided to leave it as we do. And I think the easiest way to say it is Tobias has the higher ceiling and the higher floor, which just makes him a safer choice for that. Because like you said, that's a do or die game if you're playing that third game. So you want somebody who will both give you a better chance to win probably and a lower chance to lose.
It comes down to what do you think is the true like talent level of all these guys, and it gets tricky to figure that out because pretty much everybody in this rotation is benefiting from the Brewers defense. Like
Yeah.
very few, I don't think there's a single guy in this rotation who's actually pitched as well as their ERA would say. Maybe Colin Ray's a little bit closer to that because he's had the rough the rough month here where things have started to kind of even out a little bit. But other than that, like almost every guy is overperforming how well he's actually thrown the ball this year. But yeah, for me, I feel like that's a little more extreme for Savali than it's been for some of the other starters in this mix. So, like, if I'm really trying to split hairs there, I'm picking Tobias. But again, is it a huge difference? No. And you got to keep that in mind as well when you just talk about how the Brewers are going to handle these guys anyway.
Yep.
So that's why I want to go into this question. At first, I was thinking we kind of walk through our whole roster and then do all the questions, but I think some of them tie nicely into how we put these together. So Brian asked us via email, what are your thoughts on the Brewers opting to bullpen most of the games throughout the postseason, not allowing any starter except Freddie Peralta to go more than 3 times through the order? It seems to him that they have the length guys like Ashby, Hall, Ray, Ross to create a bridge to the late inning guys. If you give starters like Montas and Tobias only 3 to 4 innings, I think you're spot on with this.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we would line it up. I think this is how the Brewers will line it up. So, we're talking about how we're going to line up this rotation and, why you might pick Myers over Savali or vice versa. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to treat every single one of these guys the same way. In the question, he said maybe Freddie can go third time through. I wouldn't even go third time through for Freddie. I'm pulling every single one of these guys after the second time through the order. And that includes, Montas and Myers. And specifically, if you're talking about like game 3 here, Montas versus Savali, if neither one of them has it from the get-go, they're going to be out pretty quickly no matter what.
Yeah.
And so again, like I talked about, I do think it could snowball even quicker if Savali's on the mound and doesn't have it. So like that buys you a little bit of time to at least get someone ready and you're not, well dug into a deep hole at that point. But at the end of the day, like that can only make so much of a difference if you're handling all of these guys in that way. So I do think that's how they're going to play it, though. You're going to have starters who are out there for maybe the first 2 times through. If it's a little dicey, maybe not even that deep. Pat Murphy,
Yep.
I think, is going to have a very, very quick trigger finger with his bullpen. And I that's pretty big thing to keep in mind with all of this as well. I know we talked about Freddie getting game 1, so Patrick asked us on Twitter, if you're in the room for when the staff is picking the postseason roster, how much do you think the value of a player, quote, earning a spot or a role plays into all of this? And he uses Freddie as an example, of has Freddie earned the game 1 start technically just by virtue of status and standing in the organization, but maybe not the best option. We talked about how we do think Freddie's the best option anyway, but just for the sake of this question, I do think it's a factor because there's a very human element to all of this, and I think Freddie does have a lot of trust from people in the organization. But again, fortunately, it's kind of coincided with he's kind of emerged as the best guy anyway, I think, to start game 1.
Yep.
But again, that I'm speculating a little bit on that. So Spencer, I don't know if you have a whole lot to add, but I do think it plays a part. It's got to be like the right guy though. Like if you have a guy who has legitimately been bad despite having a good standing, it's not really going to matter a whole lot. But for a guy like Freddie, who's maybe been a little bit up and down, but has the status, I don't think it was ever really a question whether he was going to start game 1 unless he completely fell apart down the stretch.
Yeah, I agree. I think what they've done in the past does matter a bit here. And with a guy like Freddie, who's been kind of emerged as a leader from all accounts and somebody that is seen as kind of the face of the starting pitching staff, at least right now, I think they would weigh that into it. If there was a tiebreaker to be had, that would be a good tiebreaker, I think. But I don't think over the course of a full season, if somebody clearly outperformed Freddie, but it was, someone who really, there wasn't a ton coming into the season, I think you're still giving that person the game 1 start over Freddie, not just allowing him to have it because, well, Freddie's our guy. He was our main guy coming into the year, so he's our guy. I think if there was a clear difference, that would not happen. But I think Freddie earned it. I think you could even look at last year's playoff roster a little bit and kind of point to the Jesse Winker situation. I think some people thought that was the reason he got on the team, was more that, he was Jesse Winker. He's had an all-star season before. He's done all these things. Like, we kind of had to keep him over a young guy like Garrett Mitchell. And frankly, I think the reason they kept Jesse Winker over Garrett Mitchell is that Winker was used to pinch hitting. He'd done it before, and Garrett Mitchell had barely swung a bat coming off an injury. I think that's really what it came down to. So I don't think they weigh this like super heavily, but I do think, like Jack said, it's part of the equation. It's just, I would venture to guess a pretty small one.
I think it's very case by case too, is probably the
Yeah.
best way to sum it up. But yeah, and I don't think Freddie was ever at risk of, even when Colin Ray was throwing well, I don't think Colin Ray was ever likely to get game one, because again, Colin Ray's peripherals did not point to a guy who is clearly pitching that much better than Freddie.
Right.
Like, if you're going to usurp Freddie, it has to be some pretty serious, like, frontline level performance. And I
Yes.
don't think we ever had gotten especially close to that point, even when Ray was, the mid threes ERA guy for a lot of the year. But I guess we can kind of keep moving through this roster here onto the bullpen. Got a couple of differences here. So Spencer, I'm going to start with you. So you have their entire 5-man rotation on this roster going into the wild card. You have Colin Ray and Tobias Myers in the bullpen. You wanna talk about that a little bit?
I can. Yeah. So again, in hindsight, knowing what I was actually supposed to be doing, Myers would have been starting for me. And I don't think I would have put Savali in the pen, just to be clear on that.
Mhm.
But we've seen Tobias in AAA move to the pen and perform extremely. His stuff ticked up. He threw a little harder. He seems like the type of guy who could play up out of the pen. And it's just another guy who's stretched out and ready to come in and not fill innings, but like keep you in a game if a starter does struggle early. And I think building as many of those into this wild card roster as possible is probably a good way to go. With the built-in kind of day off after the wild card, you can still set up the rotation heading into an NLDS as you really need to. I mean, there might be one less day of rest for somebody to do it, but I think you can have all 5 options on your roster available to pitch. And I do think Myers could play up out of the pen too. That's part of the reason he's on there, is that I think he would be a better option than some of the guys who would have fit in there instead of him.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. Like, I think I would like Toby Myers out of the pen more than I like DL Hall out of the pen right now, and he's on both of our rosters.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, what it comes down to is I was never going to put that 4th or 5th starter in their rotation. We both have Ray in here because I don't think either of us are expecting him to start playoff games at this point. But like, for me, it was, I just wasn't going to put Savali on here because I think, and you can have, like, there's points to be made on both sides. I just think for me, the better use of how you're going to use all the spots on your roster here, especially if Myers is going to start. I just don't really see Savali helping you out of the bullpen.
Yeah,
And
I agree with that.
And there's the potential that Savali then gets game 1 in an NLDS. Like, I know I just went on this thing about Savali, but I'm talking like in the context of do or die game. Who am I picking?
Yes.
I'm picking Tobias. But if you're going to make a deep playoff run, Savali is going to start playoff games for you. And he's probably one of your best 4 guys to start a playoff game. I'd say he's the number 4.
Yep.
But I think I would have to put him ahead of Ray right now, just by virtue of how both guys are throwing the ball. Because again, it's kind of in a larger sample, they all kind of project very similarly. But if Savali's throwing the ball a little better right now, like, that's probably who you go with in a short sample. But yeah, I just didn't think that Savali was going to be especially useful as that last pen guy. I think you keep him off the roster for this round, and then he starts potentially game 1 of an NLDS, depending on how you want to line all that up. But outside of that, very, very similar for both of us. There's 2 more things I want to touch on here. I guess it's really just one thing, because it all kind of stems from the same exclusion. Neither one of us have Brian Hudson on our playoff roster. And I guess I can kind of start with explaining this one since I've written about it. Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised because I don't think most people are hyper focused on this stuff like we are. And we probably shouldn't expect people to be like, that's not a knock at anyone. I'm saying we're the weird ones here.
Absolutely.
But just reading between the lines, I don't think Brian Hudson is pitching for the Brewers again this year. Like I know, and Pat Murphy talked about it a little bit, and I guess to me, like even just the other media people who are in the room there, no knocks on them whatsoever. They do great work as well. But I feel like I was one of the only ones who walked out of that room with the impression, maybe not walked out of the room with the impression, but even after that session on the last homestand, had the ultimate impression after weighing everything that Brian Hudson's not going to be back. Like you hear other people talking about, like, oh, Brian Hudson could be back. I think Adam McKelvey, and when he projected the roster for MLB, still had him on the playoff roster. I know Dom Catronio was kind of talking like, Hudson could still be back in the next couple days. And, I'm not saying like that's a bad take by those guys. I can see why they'd say it. But I don't think he's coming back. Just everything that has happened so far points to a guy who is not gonna doesn't have a spot right now. And I think some of it stems a little bit from, again, like Murphy kind of used the media friendly, PR friendly response of like, oh, we're seeing some progress down there. Like I think we could see him soon. But in reality, you look at the roster moves the Brewers have made, you look at what Brian Hudson's actually doing in AAA, or what he's actually done in AAA. His AAA season is over right now because the season's ended. I would be willing to guess he's one of those guys who's in Arizona right now, still keeping ready. But the Brewers wanted to see an uptick in stuff from him. And the fastball, like, barely got better. Like, basically, what happened with the fastball is the IVB has gone up about 2 inches in AAA, which is good. That's a little more carry to it. So it looks kind of like it's boring on a lefty a little bit more. And his slowest fastballs are not consistently like 88 anymore, like we were seeing. But the high end fastball isn't back either. And his average fastball velocity in AAA like didn't even go up by half a mile an hour. It was basically just he was throwing fewer of the very, very, very slow ones. So like very marginal progress there with the four seamer. And then I I haven't gotten anyone like with the Brewers to confirm this, but I did ask Murphy about it, and I kind of laid it out, and his response was like, it was very short, but it was like, "Yep, that's part of it." I think really the reason they sent him down was because of his sweeper, and I wrote about it when they sent him down. I wrote about it during the last homestand as well when he did get the promotion from AAA. They went to Kevin Herget instead. His sweeper is really what's taken a downturn since the middle of the season. It was like I think it averaged like 83 in June, and by the time the Brewers sent him down, it was down to like 78, I think. He had lost almost 4 miles an hour on that sweeper, or almost 5 miles an hour, excuse me. It was like 4.7 on average. So when they sent him down, I was like, okay, that's probably what they really want him to work on. And then I looked at the way he's using his pitches down there. At the time I wrote that story about him not getting recalled, he had thrown just as many sweepers as four seamers. And this is after he basically really went away from it his last couple weeks in the big leagues. Like he almost never wanted to throw it. At first, we kind of talked about how it didn't seem like guys were calling it, and I think that was still part of it with William versus Haas. But then you kept looking at his appearances after that. He just was not throwing it. Like I don't know if he
Yeah.
wasn't comfortable or whatever it was. And when he did throw it, it was clearly not the same pitch. It was a lot slower, and when it's slower, it's going to look a little loopier. Like the induced movement on it wasn't a whole lot different, but the velo change means the observed movement's going to be different. So it's going to look loopier when it's slower. So the Brewers sent him down to AAA. And, I kind of, I said that to Murphy. I said, I'm like, hey, he's throwing a lot of sweepers. Is this all part of it? Like, is that a big thing you want to see progress on? And he was like, yep, exactly. That's part of it. Didn't really go into detail, but to me, that's confirmation that it was definitely a big part of it. And I do think it was the main reason. The sweeper did not get better in AAA. The velocity never went up. And in his last outing for the Sounds, so the only appearance he made after I put that story out, it dropped even more. He was down to, on average, 77 with that sweeper, and it got all the way down to 75. So it was getting worse, not better. And I know Murphy kind of had the comment of like, oh, we're seeing some progress. I think he could be back. I don't think he actually made much progress at all. And if he didn't make much progress at all, I don't think he's coming back. And I think the Brewers are seeing that. And we're like, he's not making a lot of progress. There was just never a compelling reason to bring him back to the roster. And meanwhile, you have Aaron Ashby's throwing the ball really well now. It's been a mixed bag for DL Hall, but we've seen some things from him. And the other guy I wrote about a couple days ago at Brewer Fanatic, and I have him on my roster, Hobie Milner. I think Hobie Milner is ahead of Brian Hudson on the depth chart right now.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that as Hobie's a high leverage guy, but Hobie's come back up for the month of September, and he's got like a 3.7 ERA and 8 appearances, but the FIP is like 2.5. The strikeout rate's looking really good. He's getting way more swing and miss now. The weak contact is still there, and he's getting better results on that weak contact. So he's gotten that positive regression that's been due for a couple months now. It's finally starting to hit. But also, he's locating the ball better, too. He's getting ahead of guys way more. Spencer, I kind of stole your phrase that you like to use, the race to two, winning the race to two.
Mm-hmm.
2 strikes before 2 balls. I use that in the story. He's doing that a lot more, getting ahead of guys. And when he gets to 2 strikes, he's basically never throwing the ball over the heart of the plate. That was something he was doing quite a bit during the middle of the year. And he was making a little bit of his bad luck early in the year. He's not doing that now. And again, I don't mean any of this as he's a high leverage guy, but I think he's shown enough to, and I don't think he's a lock or anything, but I think he's ahead of Hudson on the depth chart. Hudson is just kind of stagnated in AAA where he hasn't gotten better. He now hasn't faced big league hitting in not over a month, almost a month. And I think Hobie has a decent chance of making it right now. Will he? I don't know, but I put him on my roster just as someone who, he'd be one of the last guys I'd use still. He's maybe like a guy, if you have a game where, say it's game 2 or something and you're losing by 4 or 5, throw Hobie out there to just try to eat up some innings for you. Or if you have a really, really short start, Hobie can maybe help you bridge the gap a little bit. I don't want him getting leverage innings or anything crazy, but he's the guy I would give that last spot to. And I think he's ahead of Brian Hudson. And you also have to weigh in as well. So first of all, you can make the case that, if Hudson's still got the diminished stuff that hasn't gotten a whole lot better, is he one of their best relievers? Murphy in that same media session, kind of subtly hinted at, they don't think he's one of their best 8 right now. And that's why he's not here. The diminished stuff version of Brian Hudson is not one of their best 8. Cause he made kind of a weird comment about, well, we could have kept him up here, but we never, if he would have stayed up here in his current form, he probably wouldn't have pitched a lot because he wouldn't have been one of our most trusted guys. Because he said something along the lines of he could have stayed up here, but he probably wasn't going to pitch a lot. So there's that to think about. But then there's also just the fact of, even if Brian Hudson's looking a little bit better outlook wise, how many games is Hudson actually going to be able to pitch in a 3-game wild card series? 1?
Yeah.
If you give that last spot to Hobie's got a rubber arm. He could pitch all 3 games if you needed him to. I'm not saying he will, because there probably won't be that many spots for him. But just in terms of availability or a guy who can stand up and be ready in about 2 minutes.
Yep.
Hobie's your guy. So it's kind of a combination of the trajectory that these 2 guys have been on. But, and I know this started kind of as me not necessarily talking about Hobie. I was talking more about Hudson because neither one of us have him. And I'll let you kind of comment on Hudson specifically. But yeah, I don't think Brian Hudson's in the mix. I really don't. I think he's a depth guy now if they suddenly need to add another guy to the roster. But he really hasn't gotten better in AAA. I know the results are good down there, but the stuff hasn't gotten any better. The sweeper sure as heck has not gotten better. It's gotten worse, if anything. And the availability is kind of a question with him. He hasn't been in the big leagues for a while. I think if he was going to be on the roster too, he would have been up by now. Because they would have wanted to get him, I think, multiple outings in the big leagues in the regular season before putting him on a playoff roster. And they had opportunities to call him back up. He was on multiple days of rest when they called Herget up, and they didn't call him up. they picked Herget instead. And yeah, I none of this seems like a guy who actually is seriously in their plans. So that's part of the reason why I gave it to Hobie, but also just I think what the form Hobie's in right now is something that can serve you as one of the last guys
Mhm.
in the playoff bullpen. And you can read that. You can read all of these stories I put up at Brewer Fanatic because they're probably a better explanation of all of this than me trying to ramble about it without a clear cut script in front of me. But again, what I keep coming back to is I don't think Brian Hudson's making the roster. I really don't. I'd be kind of surprised at this point if he does.
Yep. I mean, I don't have him on there either, and I would put Hobie over him if I were making that next choice. And I think we would have the exact same if I were doing it in terms of what I would like, because I would have put Tobias there and I wouldn't have put Savali in the bullpen. And it would have been Mears or Milner for that last spot. And I was thinking about Mears and some of the heavy lefty arms in the pen if you go Koenig, Ashby, Hall, and Hobie. But as you talked about it, if you're using Hobie, it's not like you're using him to get a lefty out. You're using him for just any scenario to try and eat an inning or two because it's needed. As that last guy in the pen, probably like I, I don't think it matters that he's lefty in that scenario. It's more about the overall build of what he is as a pitcher and what he's giving you in that spot. So yeah, I would have Hobie over him. I honestly, if I was choosing, I think I'd have Mears over Hudson right now too, and I would bet that the Brewers might as well, because they did activate Mears. And I think they wanted to get a look at Mears, whereas they weren't really in that same spot. Granted, they couldn't put Mears in AAA to do like a rehab, so that may have played a part in this too, where this was the only chance to bring him back or to see him pitch in a game again before the playoffs. But I kind of felt like him getting activated was a sign that they were at least going to give him a look here. My guess is today's outing and the home run is probably going to limit his opportunity here. But, and I tweeted about this, and I'm not going to ramble about it, but I will say this has not worked out for Nick Mears yet as a Brewer. I would very much like to see him back next year. I expect him back next year, and I think an offseason working with the Brewers and a spring training working with the Brewers could go a really long way. He has good stuff, like really, really good stuff. And I think they'll figure him out, but I don't think it's going to work out this year. And that's just how it is. And of course, he had the Brewers reliever trade deadline acquisition curse of just giving up home runs every single time he throws the ball for some reason. And it's very annoying and frustrating, but yeah, but yeah, to wrap it up, I agree with you. I think Hobie's ahead of him, and I don't even think it's all that close in the Brewers' mind right now. I think what they could bring, and you brought up a really good point on saying Hudson's pitching once max in a 3-game series. And if you put him in a second time, it's not going to go well. We saw what happened the couple times they tried to do that. So I think that definitely gives Hobie another advantage over him too.
Well, kind of touching on Mears a little bit because I said we'd come back to it during this part. Sorry for everyone who's listening. I feel like we're a little bit all over the place just because there's a lot to go through here. But yeah, I think they wanted to give Mears a serious look, and I actually debated putting him on here over Hall.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because again, there's the lefty thing, and like Hobie could eat some innings for you, and it's been like kind of mixed bag for DL. Like the overall numbers since he came back are still pretty solid, which is why I ultimately put him on here because I think at the end of the day, just that total performance with the non completely screwed up knee version of DL Hall, like you take that,
Yeah.
and I think you've seen enough to ultimately give him that edge. But I weighed putting Mears on here because again, the Brewers brought him back. The stuff is as good as anybody in the bullpen. Like and this is something I made sure to note when they acquired him. He was in like the top 15 for reliever stuff plus at the time the Brewers traded for him. Like it is that good. It's good velo, high IVB, the breaking balls. I I think that's one thing to really work on with him over the offseason is the breaking balls. I want him to
Mm-hmm.
follow like the Trevor.
Yep.
He seems like Trevor McGill 2.0 to me, and that it's a fastball with very similar characteristics and shape and velo. And it's also, you know, has 2 breaking balls. Trevor McGill had already decided by the time he came to the Brewers that he wanted to scrap the slider and make the curveball harder and shorter. Mears still throws both, but I think that's the path for him too. Just consolidate it into one breaking ball, go for a hard, short curve, or if you wanted to, you could go for a hard, short gyro slider because the observed movement on those is going to be kind of similar anyway, where it's just sharp late drop. But try to kind of close the gap in the separation because there is such a thing as getting too much separation on your pitches. And like when you have a breaking ball that's really big, like it can make it harder to get chases or swing and miss because it can look like it's separating from that fastball so early. So I think Mears could benefit from that. But yeah, he's one of those guys who I don't, it's not going to happen for him this year. It's too late. I don't think he's going to be on a playoff roster, but I still like him a lot long term. There was one other guy I was talking about too who just had not impressed this year, but like you give him a year of working with the Brewers and he can do some really big things. I don't know. Maybe it was Nick Mears. I say that with a lot of guys, I feel like, but he's very much in that camp of, yeah, I think if you give him time to actually really sit down and the Brewers can kind of mold him into what they're hoping he can be. I still like him a lot long term. It's not going to happen this year, but on the Brewers reliever trade deadline curse, it's always the home runs.
Yeah.
Like Mears spent most of his season in Colorado. I think he only gave up like 1 or 2 home runs.
Yep.
He had like a 0.3 home run per 9. And now he's come to the Brewers and he's a dinger machine. It happened to Matt Bush too. Matt Bush you could kind of at least see coming a little bit because he always had a small home run problem. Like when he got hurt, it was home runs. And it made sense with his arsenal. It makes a little bit of sense with Nick Mears' arsenal too, where it's like the fastball has no lateral movement. It's all based on ride and carry. And if you're missing down with that pitch, guys can very easily drive it out of the park. I mean, it even happens with like Trevor McGill too. When Trevor McGill gets hit, it's usually loud contact in the air because of the way his stuff works. So it's a similar deal for Mears and for Matt Bush. It was kind of just an existing issue that was a smaller issue became really bad. The funniest one to me will always be Taylor Rogers.
Made no sense. Zero.
So I'm gonna give a homework assignment to all the listeners or all the viewers. Go look up Taylor Rogers on Baseball Reference, and they have that table of all the stats. And at the bottom of his career stats table, they split it by team. They do this for every player. It's split up by team. So go look at Taylor Rogers' page, look at his splits by team, and then look at his home run rate. You'll see it was like I think with the twin or not the Twins, with the Giants right now, it's like 1 per 9, which is not great, but not terrible. With the Twins, it was like 0.7 or 0.8, somewhere in that range. With the Padres, it was like 0.2. And then with the Brewers, it was like 3 per 9, which was really frustrating because he essentially got better at every other aspect of pitching, except he could not stop giving up home runs. He walked fewer guys. He struck out more guys. He threw more sliders. The slider was better. The slider had more movement. The slider got more whiffs, but he couldn't stop giving up home runs. So I can't explain why this is happening, but it's happening again to Nick Mears. I think he'll be fine long term. But yeah, I don't see it happening this year. That's why we have him both off of our rosters. But I think aside from that, we have the same catching core. Obviously, there's not really debate there. I think just by virtue of having enough bats on your roster, you're going to carry Eric Haas. How much he's going to play, I don't know, but maybe he could hit in a big spot as a pinch hitter. The only other difference that we have is basically that last spot on the bench. I picked Tyler Black. You picked Isaac Collins. You want to talk about first why you picked Isaac Collins for that final roster spot?
Yeah, I figured, honestly, it mostly came down to, I think if they do have a big-ish pinch hitting appearance, it's going to be a Haas or a Sanchez or even a Bowers, depending on the DH or whatever that day. So Black's value is the bat. We really haven't seen much of the bat at the major league level. I think Collins can bring, well, Black's stolen bases really well in his career, so I guess you could make the argument that he could be the runner. I do think Collins might be more comfortable as a base runner in the majors currently. He's already doing it right now, and I know he can at least give you defensive value if he has to go in and play a position. At least I should say it won't be major negative defensive value if he has to go in and fill in the outfield or the infield at a second base, maybe even a third base, or a corner outfield spot. So I just viewed it as more a safer pick, but I do think I went back and forth between him and Black quite a few times. Like Black has the ceiling with the bat that could actually be helpful in a pinch hitting appearance that I don't think Collins does. So it's a toss up for me for sure.
Yeah, so to me, it's, we talked earlier, you're probably going to play either the Mets or the Braves in that series. If you play the Mets, there's a chance the Mets only have one left-handed pitcher in their bullpen. And that was like the starting point for me. Like and I was kind of thinking this for a while, if the Brewers are playing a team that is going to throw mostly righties out of the bullpen, because the Mets have a couple left-handed starters. So the Brewers are going to see left-handed starters if they face the Mets, but Tyler Black's not starting a game no matter what. But if you're facing a team that has a lot of righties in the bullpen, you could see Tyler Black get a pinch hit appearance. So I think it works out more cleanly if you play the Mets. The Braves have a couple lefties in their bullpen, most notably Aaron Bummer.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, I could still see some value in rostering Black as like a decoy pinch hitter. Now,
True.
is he gonna fool anyone? I don't know, because I think there are some managers who could very easily see through. They're not actually going to hit Tyler Black here, are they? Or even just looking at the fact that he hasn't really accomplished anything in the big leagues and still saying, I'm okay with this matchup, I'll take it.
Yep.
But just in the event that you put Tyler Black out there, they go to a lefty, and then you pull him, and that's when you pinch hit Haas or someone like that. I could still see it. But either way, like his value it's a very hyper specific supplementary matchup kind of role. And when you get into the playoffs, like that's what's really interesting about playoff roster construction.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a short series, you can really be putting a guy on the roster like for one super specific situation in
Yep.
case it crops up. Like that's why you had Jesse Winker on the roster last year. Jesse Winker couldn't hit to save his life because his body was broken, but he would still lay off pitches outside the zone and draw walks. Jesse Winker was on that roster last year to pinch hit with nobody on base and draw a walk and then get pinch run for. That's what he was on the roster for. Joey Wiemer, I thought was on the roster to pinch run, but to pinch hit, but they pinch ran him in that wild card series last year. But again, it made sense because like Joey Wiemer hit lefties really well that year. So if there's like a very specific spot, in fact, there was one. It was with the bases loaded where they hit Sal. That
Yes.
was the spot for Joey Wiemer, and they didn't use him. But like that's the spot. Bases loaded there. Joey Wiemer could maybe come in against a lefty and put one big swing on the ball, and boom, that swings a series. So that's a big part of playoff roster construction, especially those last guys on the roster can be on the roster for a very, very specific purpose. And that's basically why I had Tyler Black. So if I'm understanding this, like from my point of view, that's kind of how I'm thinking of it. Do you maybe you feel like there's maybe a Collins isn't filling that role anyway in your mind, so then you might as well give the spot to a guy who's a little bit more flexible in terms of what he can do for you?
Yeah, that's more how I was looking at it. But I thought about it from your perspective with Black. Like that was kind of how I was looking at the potential to keep Black on it. It just ended up being I might prefer Collins go to second base over Monasterio, even if something happens. Like I don't want Andrew playing much defense at all. And yeah, that was more how I ended up looking at it. More defense than anything else, if it came down to it.
The final question we'll take, like in terms of playoff roster construction here, this comes from Nate on Twitter. He asked, "Is the postseason roster made up from the active roster?" So, for example, if Brian Hudson makes the postseason roster, does that mean someone else becomes ineligible to get him back on the active roster? So, if I'm interpreting this question correctly, I think what he's asking is, do you have to pick your playoff roster from like the 26-man pool that you have right now in the big leagues? Meaning, if Hudson joins the 26-man pool, do you have to pull someone out of it to make room for him? Basically, the best way I can answer this is your playoff eligible players are, for starters, anyone who was on the 40-man roster on September 1st,
Mm-hmm.
and through kind of a little bit of I don't want to call it a loophole, but like teams kind of use it that way
Yeah.
sometimes. anybody in your organization can also, anybody who is in your organization, period, whether you were on the 40 man or not, by September 1st, they can also be on a playoff roster if you petition to the commissioner and say, hey, he's on the roster for this guy who's on like the 60-day IL.
Yep.
So like this is how the Brewers put Josh Donaldson on their playoff roster last year. He was still in the minor league. He was in their system by the start of September, but he didn't come up until like a week into September. And he wasn't
Yep.
on the 40 man either because they signed him to a minor league deal. He came up and they were able to put him on the roster because they could say, hey, he is, who was on the 60-day IL at that time? Somebody. They could say, but they can basically, you can pick a guy who hasn't played with the team for a couple months and just say, hey, he's on there for this guy. And most of the time, the commissioner's office will let it slide. So, like in the case of Jacob Mizorowski, the Brewers could still put him on the playoff roster and say, hey, we're trying to put him on the playoff roster for Robert Gasser.
Yep.
And the commissioner's office will probably say, okay, that's fine. So that's basically your pool. So, like to answer your question, the active roster really doesn't have anything to do with it. So, like if the Brewers wanted to put Brian Hudson on the playoff roster, they could. There's really no hoops they have to jump through to do it. They could still, if they wanted, like you can roster Brian Hudson and, you'd have to obviously pull guys from the current, technically it's 28 right now who are in the big leagues, but you could put Hudson on the roster and it doesn't have an impact on anyone's future eligibility unless he replaces a guy mid-series who suffers an injury. If he's replacing a guy during the series who suffered an injury during the series, then the player he's replacing becomes ineligible for that round and the next round.
Yes.
But otherwise, you can basically, if you're putting Brian Hudson on the playoff roster to start the wild card round, you put him on, and there's no consequence to any other player in the organization, no matter who he's replacing. It's probably the best way to answer that. But hopefully I articulated that well enough to the point that it made sense. But that kind of concludes our talk on the playoff roster specifically. So we'll kind of dive into just a couple more playoff related questions here. She said, Kami asked us on Twitter, how confident are you in this lineup producing runs in the postseason? Spencer, do you want to start with this one since I just talked roster stuff for like 5 minutes?
Absolutely, I do. I think this is a hard question for me because just generally, I do believe that there are just random ups and downs in a season and including the playoffs for an offense. I think this is an offense that is capable of producing runs in the playoffs. There's a bit more power than there was last year in the lineup. I think that's important. I think having the ability to hit home runs in the playoffs is extremely important. In fact, it's probably the most important thing for me for an offense. If you look at last year's team, however, or last year's playoffs, it doesn't really matter if you had done it in the regular season necessarily. The D-backs did not hit a ton of homers last year in the regular season. They got to the playoffs, guys like Alec Thomas start putting some out. They start hitting more homers than they did all regular season, and that's how you make the run. But I do think we have guys with power in this lineup, and that means they can score runs. I think it also matters that the Brewers are capable of scoring without the home run ball, though. They've shown it all year, I believe, or at least at one point. I don't know the current stats, but into September, they had the best record win percentage in baseball in games that they didn't homer. So they've shown the ability to score runs without the home run ball, and they've also shown that they can hit homers. I think that's a good sign in a 3-game series, potentially a 2-game set. That doesn't mean they're going to. I mean, it just means that they can. So I think in a confidence level, I just have a really hard time putting any sort of number on it. But I would say I'm relatively confident that they can. I can't really put a number on it that they will, really, I guess is how I would word it. So, Jack, what are your thoughts on it?
I think I'm just going to go off of that point of what you talked about. Like I hate giving this answer, but you can't project anything for the playoffs, really.
No.
It's just such a small sample. But if you were to ask me, do you think this lineup is going to roll over in the playoffs? My answer is no. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm expecting, though, there's probably going to be one game in this series where the Brewers have a very low scoring game. They might win, they might lose. But I'd be willing to bet there's going to be one game in this wild card series where they just don't really do a whole lot on offense. I don't think it's going to be a full series thing. But then again, full series could only be 2 games. But I'm not going into this series afraid that it's going to be a huge problem is probably the best way to put it. I don't think you can be confident in anything in the playoffs, to go back to the phrasing of the original question. And I think if you're going into this is going to sound really cynical. If you're going into the playoffs confident in anything, as a fan, I think as a team, you need to carry confidence into the playoffs.
Yeah.
If you're going into the playoffs with confidence as a fan in certain things, you're far more likely to get a very rude, disappointing, and heartbreaking awakening than you are to be rewarded for that confidence. It's just the nature of the game and the
Yeah.
nature of a short series and just the nature of the probability of your team winning the World Series. Like, the field narrows down in a very unpredictable and very quick, sudden fashion. So I think the answer to the question is it's not a huge concern for me. It's probably the best way to put it. I'm not going to say you should be confident in anything, but I'm not going into this series, afraid that the lineup is just going to disappear.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't be surprised though if there's one game in this series. I think it's going to be a 3-gamer, to be honest. Like, if you want my soft prediction, I think it's going to be a 3-gamer. There's probably going to be one game in there where the Brewers don't really do a whole lot, but I think we're also going to see a decent amount of what made them fairly dynamic at times throughout the season, the majority of the season. So, next question we'll take another one from Patrick. This is kind of an interesting one. So he asked, how do you guys think players approach the playoffs, like relating to adjustments and mechanics and things like that? So the example he gives is, if a player's not 100% comfortable with an adjustment they've tried for the last 100 at bats or 5 starts, do they go back to their old mechanics because it's a 3 or 7 game series? I don't think it really changes a whole lot from the process throughout the regular season. Like, the amount of very little things that guys are constantly changing throughout the regular season. Like, and for me, there's a difference between like very subtle changes that you might not even notice if you're watching the game and like more sweeping changes to
Yeah.
mechanics and things like that. Like, if I see a player who's making a ton of big changes throughout the year, I'm not feeling good about that guy at all because that tells me he's not comfortable with anything and he's just lost. But even the very best players make a ton of really small tweaks throughout the season, and it's almost always based on just how you're feeling in that moment. And like that, you pick up on that more like just for me being in a big league clubhouse this year. You talk to some guys. Like, I know when I talked to Chris Hook for something I wrote about just kind of the tweaks Freddie had made, Hook kind of kept coming back to, like, this isn't anything new for him. He does this stuff. He always kind of tinkers with this stuff behind the scenes. It changes a little bit start to start. It's more of a people don't always notice it kind of thing. And I just happened to be asking about it at that time. But like, and all the stuff I was asking about, it turns out it wasn't actually the first time Freddie had tried any of it. Like, he was just going back to it in that moment because it was what felt the best. So with that in mind, I think you approach the playoffs like you would the regular season, in the sense of, you're going out there before the game still, you're trying stuff, you're taking BP, you're hitting in the cage, whatever, throwing a pen, and you're going to say, "Hey, this feels good right now. I'm going to do it." And it's all like very, like I said, very very subtle changes under or within the same larger way that your mechanics work. Like, it's not going to be anything crazy, but like a lot of times, like, just very little things within those mechanics are constantly changing throughout the year. So it's going to be the same deal there where, you're like, hey, this feels good right now. Like, this little thing feels good right now. This is what we're going to use right now in the playoffs because it's what feels good. So I think in that sense, it's probably very, very similar.
Yeah, I think the only way I could see, like, that exact scenario of what Patrick is asking about is if, and this is probably not super common, but if there's something I'll use Yelich as an example here. Let's say he was doing something the last 100 at bats because it was helping his back feel better, but he wasn't hitting super well while doing it. I could see him going back to something that hurts his back in a playoff stretch because he just is going to lay it all out there and deal with the type of uncomfortability because it's working better for him. Like that type of thing, I could see maybe they revert back to what they've done in the past just because it might not be super comfortable, but it was just getting better results. Like maybe they do that in a playoff run, but I agree with what you said. I think it's more they're always tinkering. They're going to find something that's comfortable in that moment. It doesn't matter if it's regular season or playoffs. They're just going to be where they are, what feels good, what can I do that's going to put me in the best spot to move forward in the next 5 games, whether that was game 100 through 105 or the NLDS.
There's a quote from someone, and this is going to sound really bad because I can't remember who the quote's from, and I can't remember word for word what it was, but it's like it was from a hitter, and it was like verbatim, or like something along the lines of, throughout the course of a season, you're only going to feel like you actually have your good swing like maybe 2 times out of 10. Like it was a
Yeah.
really low number. Like you're never going to feel like you have your 100% a swing more than like 2 times out of 10. And really the whole point of being, the whole methodology or the whole path to being productive as a big league player is you have to be able to perform when the mechanics aren't 100% where you want them to be. Because that's going to be the way it is the vast majority of the time. Like, and I think just in general, people who played sports recognize this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I know I didn't play a lot of baseball, but there were like times where you go out there and you're like, holy cow, I feel really, really good today. Like everything just feels great.
Yeah.
But it sticks out to you because it doesn't usually feel that way.
Yes.
Like that athletes experience that, and it's rare. Like it only happens in little spurts where you're in that zone. So like I don't know if anyone's ever going in, not everyone. I would be willing to bet most guys are not going into the playoffs anyway, like 100% comfortable with everything about where they're at physically and about their mechanics. So I think just in general, the premise here is kind of talking about a situation that I think is like more common than you would think, just with the
Mm-hmm.
constant tinkering and you're rarely like 100% comfortable with where you're at. So I think that's a big part of all of this. But that's to digress and to keep things moving here. Next question we have comes from John. He asked, should the Brewers intentionally lose the final 3 regular season games? Not to set up matchups or anything, but because they're incapable of losing 4 in a row, and this would guarantee them a game 1 wild card victory. I'll hang up and listen. John, I think you're onto something. You nailed it. The Brewers drop the next 3. They are a slam dunk
Yep.
to take a 1-0 lead in the wild card series. So I think they could do worse things than listen to your advice.
Yeah. I can't believe I didn't think of this first. They should absolutely do this.
Yeah.
They should just throw position. Oh, they can't anymore. There's rules against pitching position players without certain. So have your starter go out there, give up like 10, get into the 6th inning, and then throw Jake Bauers the last 3 innings, all 3 games, and just really ride that out. See what we can end up with. Bauers getting like 15 innings where his ERA ends up. That's what my goal is in this Mets series.
Michael asked us on Twitter, where does this team rank among the division winners of the last 7 years for the Brewers, that is? Could they be better than 2018 despite a few less wins due to clinching early? So I'm going to say the 18 team was better. So I guess there's like two paths to take with the answer. If you're just talking about the overall quality of the team, I think 2018 was better, and we can get into that. In terms of how far this team can go in the playoffs, I think they can do what the 18 team did, maybe even more. But a lot of that is, again, like you never quite know what's going to happen in the playoffs. Like every team that is in the playoffs has the capability to make noise in the playoffs because they're in the playoffs. Like that's really all there is to it. And that's like the one element of playoff talk that sucks for me, because so many times you really just have to say, I don't know, this could happen.
Yeah,
Maybe it will, maybe it won't.
exactly.
Like, there's just so much you cannot try to project. I think you can go into a series and maybe be like, hey, these are some weaknesses that this team has that are, you know, not helpful in the regular season, but can be especially detrimental in the playoffs.
Yeah.
I think last year the Brewers not hitting home runs fell into that camp because for all of the unpredictability of the playoffs, you do know that like you got to hit for power in the playoffs to win. Like that's one where you look at the numbers and it's pretty clear. And the Brewers did not hit for power, especially home run power. So you kind of knew going in that had the potential to sink them. But on that front, I guess it kind of ties into why I'm not going to say this team is better than 2018. On offense, the 2018 team hit fewer home runs than this team has this year. Or I got that backwards. The 2018 team hit more home runs than this team
Yeah.
has this year. This team does not have the same kind of power up and down the lineup where it's multiple 30 plus home run hitters from that year. In 18, you had MVP Yelich, you had Jesus Aguilar, you had Travis Shaw, Ryan Braun, Mike Moustakas, like all of these guys who I don't think all of those guys passed 30, but most of them did. I think Moustakas was like in the upper 20s or something. Like you had a lot of guys who hit for power on that team, home run power. You don't have that here. Willie Adames is the only guy with over 30. Reese Hoskins has 25, I think. You've got multiple guys who are over 20. Basically, it's this team is not bad at hitting the long ball. It's just not one of their top strengths, and they're not as good at it as
Yep.
the 18 team was. And then when you talk about the bullpen, I think the comparison here between these two comes a lot from the pitching staff is structured very similarly, where it's bullpen heavy and you kind of just try to piece things together on the starting end. But I would say the 18 bullpen was quite a bit better than this bullpen, especially going into the playoffs because obviously you had Jeremy Jeffress having a career year. You had prime Josh Hader going multiple innings. You also had a resurgent Corey Knebel in 2018, and I will maintain that Corey Knebel, from the time he was called up from AAA after that brief demotion through the playoffs, was the best stretch of relief pitching I have ever seen. He was almost quite literally untouchable for those final weeks of the year. And I don't know if we're ever going to quite see someone throw the ball that well out of the Brewers bullpen and have that kind of production in that kind of sample. I think Devin Williams is pretty close, but
Yeah.
again, you're talking about stuff like that. And you had like multi-inning playoff Brandon Woodruff was better than I would say he's for as good as Ashby's been. I'd say what Brandon Woodruff did that year is still a little better
Yeah.
than Ashby. It's better than DL Hall. It's better than Joe Ross. Like, things like that. But these are two very good teams. I would say that this team ranks pretty highly among the division winners. There's not a lot of them, but I would say they're definitely up there. I would not quite put them on the 2018 level, though, is what I'm getting to.
Yep. Agreed. I think it's 2018 first, and it's either this year or 2021 for the second. I wouldn't put last year's team in that group, but 21's pitching staff was pretty ridiculous. It just was pretty unbelievable.
Yeah,
It
the
really was.
knock on 21 is just the offense, but
Yes.
even I remember going into that year though thinking like if any Brewers team is going to win the World Series, I think it's going to be this one.
Yeah.
Like that team because they actually finished the year hitting quite well and their overall offense as a team after they added Adames was pretty
Yeah.
okay. Like you had arguably the best pitching staff in baseball and an okay lineup. Like you felt like and that was a year too where there was like nobody who you could circle in that playoff field who was like, "Oh, these guys are just way, way better than us."
Right.
Like, even the Dodgers at you couldn't say like, "Oh, this team is way, way better than us." Like, if you look at the Dodgers this year and you look at the Brewers, can the Brewers beat the Dodgers in a short series? Absolutely. But if you're looking at those two rosters, you have to go, well, maybe it's actually probably narrowed down a little bit because the Dodgers have lost so much pitching.
Yep.
But I think if you
I think the
looked at it
Phillies roster is a better example this
right,
year.
yeah, the Phillies roster is probably a better example. That's a better roster than the Brewers have. Yeah, but you didn't. I don't feel like you had that going into those playoffs in 21.
No.
But obviously, it didn't work out because the offense struggled. But yeah, I think, and it's tough too because those are two very differently constructed teams. so it
Mhm.
gets a little harder to compare them. But yeah, just for the sake of the question, I would still put 2018 above this team. Moving on to Matt Trueblood, who asks, would you rather fight two Sal Frelick-sized Gary Sanchez's or one Gary Sanchez-sized Sal Frelick? Do you have any
This
opinions
this
on
is a
this?
great question
It's a
because
good. I know it's. I thought for a really long time about this one, and I'm not sure I have a great answer.
I don't know if I do either. I mean, Gary's slow. So if he's Sal Frelick size, he's probably still pretty strong. Obviously, we're worried about two guys coming at us, but the speed element isn't there. Now, if I get Sal Frelick, who's known to be scrappy, this is a hockey player back in the day, in Gary Sanchez's body, I guess my question is, do they get the speed of the body they're in, or do they get their normal speed? This is where I come back to it, but I'm assuming they get the speed that they have currently.
Yeah,
And
because
if that's
it's
the
just
case,
size, not. There's a difference. I feel like between size and like stature, like build, just
right.
pure size.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think I'm going with the two Sal Frelick sized Gary Sanchez's, but it's very close.
yeah. I think I would too. I mean, the first answer is I'm not athletic or muscular or strong or at anything like that, so I'm getting my rear end kicked either way.
Well,
But
yeah.
if I had to pick one, I'm picking the two Sal Frelick sized Gary Sanchez. And like, here's the deal. Like, I know Sal doesn't hit the ball very hard, but like, it's not like Sal is a scrawny dude,
Mm-mm.
especially like for his height. He's not like a scrawny dude. So if you like basically when I see Gary Sanchez size Sal Frelick, I picture like you're taking Sal Frelick and like when you're on like Photoshop or something and you're like scaling up an image and you like grab the slider on the corner and just drag it
It's
out.
like you grabbed a mushroom in Mario.
Or that, yeah, that too. You could say that. Maybe that's a better analogy to use. But yeah, if you're taking Sal Frelick and you're just making him larger overall, but he's still Sal Frelick,
Yeah.
that's a scary dude. So give me the two Sal Frelick sized Gary Sanchez's because I'm assuming that it's two smaller versions of Gary that still are not the quickest. So maybe you can outmaneuver him a little bit. I would rather fight none of them. I'd rather not fight a professional athlete because that's not going to go well for me. But I think I'm going to take the two Sal sized Garys. Seems like we have a consensus on that one. The last question we'll take. This is not Brewers related, but someone asked us, will there be a justice campaign for Rowdy Tellez? So if anyone's not aware, I think most of the Brewers fandom has heard about this because, Rowdy was here last year. The Pittsburgh Pirates DFA'd Rowdy Tellez a few days ago when he was 4 plate appearances shy of a $200,000 incentive for reaching 425 plate appearances. And that's full stop. That's just scumbag behavior. Like
Yep.
$200,000.
Yeah.
And like it's not uncommon for teams to cut players before they hit incentives, but usually that's like even like 500,000 or like over $1 million, like some like $200,000 in an incentive if you're penny pinching that at this point in the season too. Like a lot of times it's like, okay, maybe you cut a guy when there's, a couple months left or something. To cut a guy within the last full week of the season when he's 4 plate appearances shy of a plate appearance incentive, he's 4 plate appearances shy of $200,000. And especially because like he had been hitting well for them in the second half. Like, I don't know if you can necessarily say, I don't think his September splits were good, but it becomes increasingly difficult to say there was a performance based factor behind this. Like, a lot of times you see it happen too if you have like a back of the rotation guy who's having kind of a middling season, but he's eating innings and you cut him
Yeah.
before he gets to like the innings threshold. I think the Cubs actually did it with like Hector Neris kind of at the back end of their bullpen. Like he was going to hit an incentive for games finished, but he hadn't really been good this year either. Like that one doesn't necessarily raise as many eyebrows, but something like this it's not good. Don't do this. This is not a good way to convince free agents to sign with your ball club.
Oh,
So I do feel sympathetic for Rowdy over that. He's probably well off financially already, more so than a lot of us because he plays professional baseball, but it's just tough in general when you've been producing for most of the last few months and you're getting let off right before the end of the season because they don't want to pay you another $200,000 in this industry. Like,
yeah.
I think we
And
can do by
not
people a little better than that.
Yeah, and not doing it earlier, and, like, if you do it in August, he gets a chance to get claimed and potentially be on a playoff roster or something if
Right,
things
exactly.
go
Like
well, like,
that's mhm.
the timing of it all just completely screws him even beyond the money, like, there's just a lot of things that it makes worse for him when the Pirates have been out of it for quite some time, like, if they wanted to make this move and just get him off the books and not worry about this, they could have done it a month ago and it wouldn't have been a problem for anybody. So it's just really crappy. It's the bad way to treat employees and people who work for you and people who gave you a lot during the year. And there was a really good article a week or so ago in the Post Gazette in Pittsburgh, and it was I can't remember the author. I think I tweeted it at one point. Either way, he wrote about kind of comparing and contrasting their owner and Mark Ananasio and how the Brewers have done and how their front office operates. And even in that article, he made some of the points along these lines of like the Brewers treat their players right. The Brewers love their Brewers players always come away from the place talking highly of the organization and all these things. And he he ripped the Pirates a new one in it, and it was pretty fun to read the comments under it too from Pirates fans who were just like, I would love to be a Brewer fan right now. Like they always compete, they always have these things going for them, and it was fun to see it from another perspective, how other teams are kind of viewing fans, and even the writers for other teams are kind of viewing the Brewers right now as like this really well run franchise, and that wasn't always the case as a kid. So it's really fun to kind of see that and hear that type of perspective. And then, of course, a week later, they go out and they do this to Rowdy just to further prove the point of what the article was trying to get at. So, yeah, just wanted to throw that in there too.
With that, we will move on to the minor league sandbox. There's not as much for you to go through this week because the minor league season is over, but Spencer does still have some notes in here, so I'll give you the opportunity to run through those very quickly.
Indeed. All right. So we'll talk about one player who finished. He didn't get any awards or anything for this, but Chad Patrick, who was acquired for Abraham Toro in the offseason from the A's, he finished the season leading the International League in AAA with 14 wins, which, whatever, wins I don't care a ton about, but the rest of the stats kind of back up how well he pitched. He had a 2.9 ERA. This was a very, very hitter-friendly environment in AAA, so any ERA under 3 is pretty insane. He struck out 145 batters. He led the league for qualified pitchers at 9.57 strikeouts per 9, and his whip of 1.09 also led the International League. So 5 pretty major categories that he was leading in. I think technically that's what they call the Triple Crown in pitching is wins, ERA, and strikeouts. It's not what I would care about really overall, but still winning a Triple Crown in the AAA in that setting is pretty impressive. And I think he's a guy we're going to see next year. I think he's going to end up. I can't remember if he needs to be protected, but if he is, I do think they're going to. I believe he does. And this is a guy who I think will probably make some starts for the Brewers next year. It wouldn't shock me if he's kind of next year's version of Tobias, just coming off of a much better minor league season. On the note of really, really good performances in the minors, the Brewers announced their minor league players of the year. On the offensive side, it was Cooper Pratt and Jesus Mate. On the pitching side, it was Craig Yoho and Casey Hunt. I have talked at length about all 4 of those guys all year, so I won't break it down much more, but I will say Mate just keeps getting more and more attention as a guy who could potentially be like the number 1 prospect in baseball at some point. That's the type of hype he's getting. The Brewers have not had a DSL player get that type of hype ever. Even Churio was more like a note as like, okay, this guy could be good, but we got to see what he can do at the next, level moving up. And that has not been how they're talking about Mate. And then on the last note, the Arizona Fall League roster was announced. Rosters were announced for the Brewers. They are sending right-handed pitcher Ryan Burchard, and I'm just going to give where I rank them in my prospect rankings right now. He's number 29 for me. Right-handed pitcher Will Childers. He was an undrafted free agent a couple years ago. I like him as a reliever quite a bit. He spent most of his time in Double-A this year. He did really well. He's number 60 for me, mostly because it's a relief-only profile, but I do like him quite a bit. Coleman Crow, who the Brewers acquired from the Mets for Tyrone Taylor and Adrian Hauser, did not pitch all season, coming off Tommy John, but he's going to hopefully get some innings down in Arizona, so that'll be good to see. He's number 38 for me, but he's a guy who could, if he shows me something pretty quickly, move back up that list. Left-handed pitcher Mark Manfredi, a pick in last year's draft. I believe we've talked about him a couple times, out of Dayton. Really good strikeout numbers this year in kind of a hybrid role for the Timber Rattlers. Have him number 58, but he's kind of in a wide range of guys who are in that same tier. Right-handed pitcher Nick Merkel. His nickname is Large Mammal. He's a very big guy. It's like 6'6", 255, I believe is what he's listed at. Kind of cuts and runs a fastball, has a decent slider. He had a really good like ground ball ratio and strikeout ratio in Double-A, so a good combo to have. He's number 73 for me. And on the offensive side, they do have three somewhat big prospects going. They have infielder Juan Baez. We've talked about him before. Really good bat-to-ball skills. He's number 26 for me. Third baseman Brock Wilken, last year's first-round pick. He is number 10 for me right now. I've talked about his struggles. Hopefully this will get him back on track. And then outfielder Luis Lara. He's number 18 for me. I kind of hyped up coming into the year. Did not hit much at all at high A, so hopefully he can get the bat going in Arizona as well. He probably just needs to mature into his body a little bit better before the bat's going to come around much. He's a small guy, doesn't weigh much, and also he's listed at 5'7". I'm not even sure if that's really the case. He might be a little bit shorter than that. So we'll see how that all goes, but some fun names to follow, and hopefully we'll get some StatCast data on some of these pitchers. I know a couple of the parks usually have that running, so it'd be cool to get some on some of the guys we haven't seen yet. And yeah, that's really all I have for this one. So Jack, I will let you come back in, but I do want to talk about one more thing quickly before we get to the Mets series preview. And I'm guessing you haven't seen it, but I did go and see just a bit outside the movie about the 1982 Brewers. And it's free press here, but I'm going to give them a shout out because obviously this is not a team I witnessed or was around for. This was well before my time. I was born almost 16 years after this 82 World Series happened. So this was well before my time. It's so well done. I felt like I had been a fan of this team watching the movie. Super cool. They brought back most of the important players from that team, especially obviously the living ones. Got some really good quotes, really good interviews. It kind of put you in a really good like mindset of how the fan base was reacting to this whole thing happening. And honestly, the biggest thing for me was that it gave me a really good reminder of like what made me fall in love with baseball, and that is in sports in general. I think the community that comes with sports and with fandom and everybody pulling in the same direction for a team. I've always heard about the parade after they lost the World Series. And there's a lot of people who are mostly more my age who look at that and go, why would we ever throw a parade for a team that lost the World Series like that? And on the surface, to me, it always felt a little weird. Like I didn't care. I was like, okay, if they wanted a parade, like why not do it? But they showed it in the movie and they talked about it. And you could tell like to these players, this was one of the coolest things they ever witnessed in their entire life. Like all of them mentioned how it made them feel so much better after losing that World Series, how they were as low as they'd ever been. They came back to this huge ovation and how it just took their mind off of this. And they talked about how Milwaukee and Wisconsin sports fans to them it's so incredible that they were willing to do this and that they did this for them and like how much they love Milwaukee. And these are guys who spent their whole career there. Robin Yount was one of the people talking about it. Some of them were a couple years. Raleigh Fingers talking about how he thinks Milwaukee is the best fan base he ever played for. He spent time with a bunch of different franchises. And like, it reminded me that while these playoffs are going to be tense, everyone's going to be very on edge during all of it. that it's pretty special that we get to watch this team compete every year and that we get to do it with a bunch of other people who care about the team and just how much it can mean to the players. I remember the 2018 team talking about how insane the fan base was during this and how cool it was. And like, I know when I'm driving around during a playoff series and I see everybody wearing Brewers stuff and everybody's just kind of in Brewers mode, how cool that is to me. And that's what sports are about for me. Like, obviously I want the Brewers to win a World Series. Would be probably the best day of my entire life. But I think just appreciating what we get to witness is important. And I get sappy about this stuff. Like, I can watch the Bucks game 6 all access and I will tear up every single time. And it's not because the Bucks won the championship. It's because of all the shots of the people in the Deer District. It's because of seeing the crowd reactions and all of that stuff. Like, to me, I'm not telling everyone how to be a fan. I'm explaining what I love about sports, and that is it for me. Like, I love that stuff, and this movie highlighted it as well as almost any like sports movie I'd ever seen. And like I said, I have no connection to this team. It's not like it brought back memories for me. It was all based on what I was seeing. So, one, it's still out right now. If you have a chance to go see it, go see it. It's really well done. And two, just something to keep in mind as we go into the playoffs that like have fun and enjoy the moment, even though there's going to be low points during the playoffs. I promise you, whether they advance or continue winning or doing, there's going to be low points where you're going to be really upset. Just remember that it is like, there's more to it than just winning or losing in these moments. And I'll even relate it. The A's are losing their team today. I don't know how many people saw Oakland fans today, but like, there were a lot of people who were pretty heartbroken, talking about how they came here with their dad, they brought their kids, they've got all these things. Like, we get this opportunity to watch this team compete every single year, and I just don't want people to take that for granted. It's really cool that we get to witness this at this time. So I'll get off my soapbox and let you preview the Mets series, but that's what I wanted to say.
No, I think all that stuff you talked about, this is why I don't like the championship or bust mentality. Not because it's a bad thing for your ultimate goal to be a championship. It should be. But if that's the only thing you're thinking about and you consider everything that's not a championship an utter and total failure, you're really missing the plot. You really are. Because
Yeah,
there's so much richness in, like you said, having a city, having a state, pulling for a team, especially just in a smaller market like Milwaukee.
yeah,
And that, at the end of the day, like, there are more experiences I think you can take from that. Like, as great as it would be to win a World Series, I think that would be everyone's favorite experience,
yeah,
but it's just one. Like, if you're, talking to your kids someday and you're talking about, what it was always like to be a Brewer fan, what some of your best memories are, and you're going down like a laundry list of memories, a World Series run is only going to have a small portion of those, especially with how consistently competitive this team has been. Like, how many people, when they talk about one of their favorite Brewers moments, are going to talk about Brandon Woodruff hitting a home run off of Clayton Kershaw in the
yeah.
NLCS in 2018? Now, if the Brewers win the World Series, I don't know if that's going to be number one on everyone's list, but I don't think it's falling off of everyone's list. Like, it's still going to be on there, and that was a year that the Brewers didn't win the whole thing. Like, it's an element of it's good to have your eyes on the bigger prize, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always needs to, especially for the fans, it doesn't mean it always
Right.
needs to be tunnel vision on that goal. And I it's tough in the moment a little bit. And I think
100%.
more people gain appreciation for some of these other moments when the dust settles.
Yes.
But you're right. Like, take it in, enjoy the experience. This is what sports is all about. And I think this is a good way just to close our podcast as well, because I think even the two of us, I think sometimes we don't always take that perspective enough because we're always trying to break things down like super technically and try to be level headed sometimes when things are both going well and when they're not going well. But you do have to take a step back from that too sometimes and just be like, at the end of the day, it's an entertainment product.
Yes.
It really is. And I mean that in a good way. Like, you're supposed to derive enjoyment from it. whether you win the whole thing or not, because there's so many things that go on, so many different teams that you're going to witness, so many teams that are going to have their own identity, going to have their own path. And guess what? Most of them are not going to win the World Series. So I think you're right. Like, just enjoy the ride, because I do think there have already been a lot of really fun moments on this one. And I'll say this even like from my vantage point of, you're in the clubhouse, you're in the press box, like, yeah, I'm doing my job, but like I'm still having a lot of fun too. Maybe I'm doing, some different things and maybe at times watching it differently than some people are, but I'm still having fun. Like, this is a fun team to watch
Right.
play baseball. And I'm saying that even as the guy who's probably complained more than most the last few weeks about how they play too much small ball and how they try to bunt too much. Like, this is still a very fun team to watch. So don't take that for granted, regardless of what happens. You can have your eye on the bigger prize while also appreciating all of the other things that one happen along the way to getting there, or all the things that happen along the way to falling short. And that's, to me, that's just the healthiest way to enjoy sports too. And again, I'm not going to tell people what to do, but I think that's a very good reminder for everyone. So I haven't seen the movie. I haven't really had a chance to. Probably won't get a chance to anytime soon with the playoffs right around the corner. But I trust your recommendations. So if Spencer says go watch it, I'm going to tell everybody else to go watch it as well. We can probably break down the Mets series now that's coming up. Actually, we probably can't because there's nothing out for the probables. The series doesn't really matter for the Brewers. All we know is Frankie Montas is pitching opposite Sean Manaea on Friday. That's a 7:10 start time, a 6:10 start time on Saturday, and then for the Brewers regular season finale, that is a 2:10 start time. I mean, what happens in this series could have some implications for who the Brewers end up facing. But again, then you have a lot of heads to heads coming up with
Yeah.
the Mets and the Braves as they're trying to make up some of these games. So it's all kind of up in the air a little bit yet. So probably not going to be the most intense games anyone's ever seen. Chances are we're probably not even going to break these down next week. I think we're just going to go straight into the playoffs, because by the time we come back to you next week, the Brewers will either be in the NLDS or their season's going to be over. I think we're all hoping it's going to be the former. Regardless of what happens, we'll be back to break down all of that action. I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about no matter what. So thank you all for listening to our playoff preview episode. I think we went a little longer than we did the past couple times, but I think it was some pretty good content to go over. I might be a little biased. But as always, thank you to everyone who listens. Thank you to everyone who gives us feedback, submits a question, leaves a review for us, has any suggestions for us, whatever it is. The show is completely useless if people aren't listening to it. So hopefully you'll come listen again next week as well. Playoff time in Milwaukee. Things are about to get interesting. Go Brewers.